Hello, lovelies. You're listening to episode 55 of the Broken Enchantments podcast, written and read by Elizabeth Wheatley. That's me. I hope you enjoy this week's episode. Be sure to check out my Patreon for next week's episode, now available. You can check out the links below. Happy listening! What's going on? Janir looked to Carlisle, but he just shook his head. Velasquez drew a deep breath. Even if we took you back to the Brevians in the valley, they would either torture or try to ransom you. That would end badly for all involved. Especially if Lord Kessam learns you are the Lord Argetallam's daughter. Janir didn't remember ever telling the elf that. The Lord Argetallam's allies will crush us like flies once they are spelled, and we do not have enchanters strong enough to combat the Chalice and Zamarza. How did he know that? As if he had read the question in her face, Velasquez answered. My son and Carlisle were spying, remember? They were not the only ones. Had Seovan and Carlisle actually been inside Valmakin? Janir had to tell her father right away. Velasquez handed her the familiar belt with her 2 black rods. These are yours. What the? I offer you your weapons and you hesitate? Take them. Janir snatched back the belt a bit too quickly. Out of the corner of her eye, the elf woman's hand fluttered a little closer to the ivory hilt of her sword. Keeping Velasquez in her line of sight, Janir examined the belt. There was nothing incongruous on it, or her carcatan. Buckling it around her waist, she eyed the elf suspiciously. Are you letting me go? Yes. Velasquez glanced to his companion. Not that Janir was complaining, but she was already confused enough without this on top of everything else. Why? Velasquez caught her by the shoulders. I know about you and Seovan. I am taking the chance that some part of you still knows it too. His words stabbed her like fishhooks. What about me and Seovan? The stone beneath her shirt pressed against her breastbone like a silent accusation. The elf looked to Carlisle. Only you know that for certain. But do you want to see Seovan broken? Janir hesitantly shook her head. Neither do I. Velasquez solemnly replied. If I am going to save my son, and thousands more besides, I need your help. Your son? Janir trembled in his grip. Velasquez knew who Janir was, knew that she was the Lord Argetallam's daughter, and yet he was speaking to her as if she was an ally. What are you saying? Janir whispered, unease, disbelief, and confusion swirling within her head in equal measures. Do you know how many will die if Lares is taken? Velasquez calmly returned. You must know. War is blind to innocence. Janir swallowed. That was something she'd tried not to think about. Once a city falls, the raping and pillaging begins. It is the same with every army. Sometimes you can hear the screams of girls for miles while... Stop! Janir covered her face with her hands. Just stop. What do you want from me? I ask nothing, Janir. Velasquez released her and stepped away. You think I would betray my father so easily? No. I merely want you to understand that you are the only way Seovan can be saved. The same goes for the kingdom. He gestured to distant Brevia. Brevia will be defeated utterly. And do you think the Slavish will stop there? They will continue on to the Aracelian nations. Sooner or later, they will march on the Sylvan forests, the rest of Slavin, and from there, who knows? Only Argetallams will be safe. And that is because only your people and Zamarza will be able to stop them. Behind Velasquez, Cariel watched with what was probably supposed to be a reassuring smile. Come. Velasquez took her by the arm and pointed her in a northeast direction. At least, she thought it was northeast. Keep heading straight. You should reach Valmakin within an hour. You're letting me go? Janir fought back a sudden throb in her temple. You trust me not to set a trap? You are an Argetallam. Velasquez shrugged. Let us see if my guess about Cheton Shrai is correct. Shivers shot down her spine afresh. Before she could ask how he knew, the elves had jogged away into the icy forest. There was no hint that they had ever been there, save for the faint imprints in the snow. Cariel lingered for a moment. You're a good person, Janir. Even if you don't remember us, you know what will happen in Brevia if you let your people go through with this. Janir was fully aware. It was something she had been trying not to think about. I know you'll choose what's right. The enchanter cleared his throat. Take care of yourself. With that, he ran after the elves, robe flapping as he whisked away into the darkness. It felt wrong, unceremonious and wrong. The more that happened, the less she was sure of herself. The story everyone had told her was riddled with gaps and pieces that didn't quite fit. Every word these elves and Cariel spoke only added more disjointed pieces to the mystery. Oh, essences, she whimpered, covering her face with a hand. Oh, I'm so confused. It was terrifying how one could get turned around in the forest without even realizing it. The temptation to stop and sleep was overwhelming, but she feared if she did, she'd never wake again. She slogged through the dark, colder by the moment. She thought she was headed in the right direction, but she couldn't be certain. Then Janir caught it. Dark light. It was difficult to explain, but it reminded her of the sun reflecting off a beetle's shell, or the pinpoints of light in black star sapphires. They couldn't be more than 300 paces through the trees. Janir hesitated, catching the clank of armor and the whicker of horses. They weren't Slavish, but nor were they elves or enchanters. Desperate enough to try anything, Janir headed toward the riders. Though she was fairly sure it was Argetallam's, she carefully edged at an angle through the trees. Before long, she caught the light of their torches. There were about a dozen of them. Several of the riders were on the ground, scouring the snow for prints. Their magic was dark and unmistakably Argetallam, but she couldn't think of how to approach them. When she couldn't see their faces, then she caught sight of a familiar, gruff figure kneeling in the snow. Cerilius! Janir didn't even realize she'd shouted his name until every last one of the Argetallams turned in her direction. She felt like she hadn't hailed him right, but she soon didn't care as she stumbled into the clearing. Everyone leapt with surprise, and every hand reached for their carcatan. Janir? Cerilius took a quick step forward. Janir nodded, a little breathless. Cerilius swallowed. I've never been so happy to see anyone. It was a strange comment, especially for him. Janir assumed he was joking and laughed. She kept laughing until her laughter became forced and then turned to trembling, uncontrollable, convulsing trembling. Shuddering like a leaf in a storm, Janir started crying. She hadn't let herself weep when she'd been a captive, but now she couldn't help it. Janir should have been worried about what the other Argetallams would think, but she had just escaped death and worse. Who were they to judge her if she cried now? Cerilius was at a loss for a moment. Then he coiled his arms around her. Hush now. He smoothed back her hair. Shh, I've got you. Janir pressed her undamaged cheek against his shoulder and held on to him like an anchor among tossing waves. Unbidden, she was reminded of Seovin's arms encircling around her as she clung to Cerilius tighter. Mort on, Cerilius? A man's unsure voice asked from behind them. Mount the horses, Cerilius commanded. We have what we came for. He rubbed Janir's back as his warriors readied for the ride to Valmakken. Cerilius's presence was a comfort, and his embrace was like a shield. Janir closed her eyes and squeezed him tighter, not wanting to let go. "Quiet," he crooned. "You're safe now. You're safe." It was less than a quarter mile to Valmakken, and Janir rode behind Cerilius on his liver chestnut stallion. They must have started searching for her not long after she was taken. Cerilius still hadn't asked her what had happened or how she had ended up outside the city with a bruised cheek. He let her sit wordlessly behind him, with her arms around his waist, and her face pressing against his back. A part of Janir was ashamed that she had shown tears, but another part of her wanted to cry again. What Velasquez had said she couldn't forget. His story, his words that so clashed with everything she'd been told by her family. His allegations named the faceless fears that had plagued her for so long now. The slavish guards let them in easily after a brief exchange of passwords and ranks. The short column of torches and riders slid into the city with the clatter of hooves and the clank of armor. Janir jolted awake as a hand lightly shook her shoulder. She must have dozed off behind Cerilius. After making sure she was awake, Cerilius swung to the ground. She clambered off the dark chestnut stallion after him and stared listlessly as the horse was led away by someone. Janir didn't pay attention to whether it was a slavish stable boy or an obliging Argetallam. "Kolbo," she murmured, not even realizing she had spoken the name out loud. Cerilius glanced at her. "What was that?" "Nothing." On cue, a stabbing sensation shot through her skull, just as it did every time she said something that appeared to make no sense. "Come along." He hesitated a moment, as if making up his mind before placing a hand on her shoulder and guiding her back toward the mansion. They hadn't gone halfway when the front doors burst open and her father appeared with Knistrith in tow, meeting her at the bottom of the steps. By the torches carried in the fists of his attendants, the Lord Argetallam's circlet glinted like a halo. Disregarding a dozen watching eyes, the Lord Argetallam was standing no less than a sword length away from her in a split second. No one spoke as he surveyed her, searching for damage. Then his eyes settled on the angry red welt on her cheek. Catching her chin under his fingers, he tilted her face into the light. "Are you well?" Janir swallowed, hoping he couldn't see the evidence of her earlier tears. "I'm all right." "Come." With a hand protectively on her back, he led her into the mansion. His guards flocked around them in a protective circle, Cerilius close behind. Knistrith hissed quickly to Cerilius, and he answered back in short, unclear sentences. Like a snake, Knistrith sidled up beside her. "Why were you outside the city?" "What happened?" the Lord Argetallam asked. Janir faltered. "I was just walking. I got lost." "Is that all?" "Janir, if there's something you need to tell us, you can." Knistrith had a hand on Janir's shoulder in an instant. In a reflexive, lightning-quick motion, Janir batted away Knistrith. It had been instantaneous, an impulse, and she hadn't even thought about it. I'm sorry." Janir groaned as the headache returned again, worse this time. That sharp, piercing, blinding throb that made her eyes water. She felt like 100 needles were being shoved into her skull. The light of the lamps and torches stabbed her eyes. Whimpering, Janir lowered her head, taking deliberate breaths until the pain reached a zenith and gradually faded. No one rushed her. No one spoke. Someone passed them in the hall, but the newcomer carried on without a word. Once the pain had dissipated enough that she could think, Janir blinked the tears away. "I'm fine." "A lie?" Knistrith nodded apprehensively. "All right." "Janir." The Lord Argetallam laid a hand on her shoulder. "What happened?" Him she didn't shove off. Janir licked her lips. Knistrith loomed at her back, uncomfortably close. "Like I said, I got lost. I went for a walk and must have gotten turned around in the forest." Janir. There was a sternness to Knistrith's tone. Swallowing, Janir cleared her throat. It was my own fault. And this? The Lord Argetallam flicked a finger over the mark on her cheek. A branch struck me in the dark. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught Cerilius's quizzical frown. No one believed her, but there was no way she could tell them the truth. No more than she could let Seovan die. She couldn't. Are you sure? The Lord Argetallam was no fool, and neither was anyone else there. But what could she tell them? Janir caught a brief glimpse of Knistrith's flaring nostrils before she ducked her head. Yes. She needed the chance to speak with him alone, but she feared asking for that in front of her aunt. Her father followed her furtive glance to his sister, eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Oddly, he didn't press for more details. The Lord Argetallam planted a soft kiss on her forehead, surprising Janir. Even Knistrith blinked. You need rest. It was all but a command. Her father turned to Knistrith. Look after her. Knistrith nodded. The Lord Argetallam left without looking back. Morton Cerilius, see her to her room, then send for Morton Canicade, and both of you meet me in my study. Cerilius bowed to the Lord Argetallam. As you command. Janir was feeling too much. Relief, confusion, exhaustion, sadness, fear, confusion, happiness, misery, confusion. To feel anything. Even at being once again alone with her aunt. She followed Knistrith toward her room listlessly, hoping that the sweet release of sleep might cleanse some of the sheer, whirling chaos inside her head. Cerilius stayed close behind, watching her like he feared she'd try to run. Even through the madness, she could sense the speckled light that was Seovan's magic. It inhabited a nearby corner, folded on the ground. Oddly, Janir had never thought about finding Seovan. A part of her wanted him to stay hidden so that she wouldn't be able to see him or do anything, and then things would be so much easier. But now, Janir stopped. Janir! Knistrith's voice called from up ahead. Are you coming? He was close. Janir could feel it. She peered down the narrow corridor. It was a storage room of some kind with crooked, rotted doors. Only one stood solid and immovable with a shiny brass lock. Seovan was down that corridor. Janir was sure of it. Milady, what are you doing? Cerilius asked. The headache was starting to return, sharp, persistent. Moaning softly, Janir bent down and partly slid off her boot just enough so that when Knistrith rounded the corner, Janir was convincingly sliding it back on. Janir? Cerilius crouched down, one hand on her shoulder. What's wrong? Sorry, Janir gasped, trying to hide how much the headache pained her. Knistrith reappeared around the corner and stared at Janir, hands on her hips, looking almost accusatory. I had a stone in my boot. Janir picked up a small pebble lying on the ground and held it up deceivingly. Stray pieces of rock weren't uncommon in a building this old. Inside, Janir burned with the falsehood. But she didn't know what else to do. Knistrith took the pebble in Janir's hand, contemplative. She searched Cerilius, but he either nodded or gave away nothing. Trusting him was instinctive, and Janir only realized then that she had made Cerilius complicit in her lie, small and insignificant as it seemed. I've been meaning to... Don't think about Seovan, Janir commanded herself. She knew she would show something if she did. Instead, she concentrated on the pebble in her hand, the same way Cerilius had had her concentrate on the gimbal, feeling its weight, its texture, the essence of it. You should have let me know. Knistrith helped Janir to her feet while Cerilius still said nothing. As they walked to Amilla and Janir's room in silence, Janir kept the pebble secretly clenched in her fist, refusing to think about anything else. Amilla was oddly unaccounted for, and Janir didn't want to speculate. Seovan's cell had been quiet, and that gave her some solace. Knistrith saw Janir bundled into bed, then shooed Ceruleus outside with her. The Morton left a lingering gaze on Janir as the door shut, studying her like some great enigma. Outside, the Mortana called for a passing Argetallam. She whispered, but Janir still caught the whispered command, ordering Ceruleus to send someone to watch the room. Canistrith said she would stay and wait for the guard to arrive. Alarm shivered through Janir. They were keeping her under watch. Under the circumstances, she couldn't rationally blame them, but was she a princess or a prisoner? Janir found one of her heavy fur tunics and laced up the front. She grabbed a pair of fresh wool leggings that hugged her skin uncomfortably tight, but at least they were warm. Curled up on her bunk, warm in bed for the first time in a very long time, Janir realized how exhausted she was. Yet, even when she could barely keep her eyes open, she needed to get away from whatever this was. Janir's mind gravitated to Seovan, to what Velasquez had said. Now that she had seen where he was, she had the power to help him, but somehow she had less power than ever before. Velasquez's words echoed inside her head. I ask nothing. But it was clear he hoped for something.
You have been listening to Broken Enchantments, written and read by Elizabeth Wheatley. Don't forget to check out my Patreon for early access to episodes, bonus content, and lots of patrons-only freebies. You can learn more at elizabethwheatley.com. And don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform or YouTube. I'll see you next time.